जगन्नाथ परमनाथ हे गोविंद थामो हाथ। जगन्नाथ परमनाथ हे गोविंद थामो हाथ। देखूं तुझको नील नभ में, देखूं तुझको जमुना जल में। शाम ढलते आना शाम, शाम ढलते आना शाम। मैं चलूंगी तेरे साथ। जगन्नाथ परमनाथ हे गोविंद थामो हाथ। जगन्नाथ परमनाथ हे गोविंद थामो हाथ। कुंजवन सजा है आज, तड़ित संग मेघराज। कुंजवन सजा है आज, तड़ित संग मेघराज। मेरा विफल जन्म जो मैं आज, विफल जन्म जो मैं आज। कह न पाई दिल की बात। जगन्नाथ परमनाथ हे गोविंद थामो हाथ। जगन्नाथ परमनाथ हे गोविंद थामो हाथ। कुंजन में मधुर गान, श्याम चरण सौंपूंगी प्राण। कुंजन में मधुर गान, श्याम चरण सौंपूंगी प्राण। कहेगी रजनी हो विभोर, कहेगी रजनी हो विभोर। तुम देर से आओ प्रभात, तुम देर से आओ प्रभात। जगन्नाथ परमनाथ हे गोविंद थामो हाथ। जगन्नाथ परमनाथ हे गोविंद थामो हाथ। जगन्नाथ।
My dear brothers and sisters, boys and girls, nice to be with you all today once again. This beautiful devotional song that you heard in Mitu's melodious voice, it was a simple sort of a adoration and aspiration of a devotee. The devotee was asking for not much else except the hand being held by the Lord. And that is, in fact, not only a simple prayer, but in itself a complete prayer. What else does one need if one is handheld by the one who knows everything and can do everything? The Lord was being addressed by many names, and the name really doesn't matter. We can go on adding to those names, but in this, you heard at least three. Jagannatha, that is the Lord of the universe. The universe is called Jagat. So, and Natha is the one who's the Lord, or the one to whom it belongs, the head, sort of the chief. So the chief of the universe, the master of the universe. And why Jagat is called, universe called Jagat? Because it has been created. Ja, it's anything which has been created, which has come from somewhere. and Gata because it has Gati, that is speed, it's moving, it's changing all the time. So that is what the Jagat means, and the one who from whom it has come, and the one who is the master of this universe is Jagannath. Paramanath, Param is, an extreme, again, including everything, the totality, and the Nath of that, the Lord of that, and Govinda. One of the incarnations of the divine is Krishna, and one of the names of Krishna is Govinda. Perhaps because he was also a shepherd. Go, is a cow. So that's how that name comes. So we can find various rationale for all the names that the divine has been given. And this is a simple prayer was for that. And the devotee could see him everywhere, in the sky, in the water, with the eyes closed and the eyes open. And that is what, the devotee can feel. Once you are devoted to the Lord, you can see the Lord everywhere, in everything, in everybody. But then the words can't say it as well as melody. Just as, a picture is worth 1,000 words, a song is worth perhaps 1,000,000 words. Now, yesterday you practiced some of the physical practices of yoga. And even on the days on which we are only talking and not doing the practices in these sessions, you can always find time to do those practices, either on your own if you already know them, or if you are just learning from this, then you can go to the video of the previous day when these practices were done and watch as you do them. That can still go on. Today's session is on one of the schools of yoga, that is Hatha Yoga. It's one of the major schools of yoga, which in fact, in a way is the most popular, not Hatha Yoga in its entirety, but at some elements of it. That's what we do in an average yoga class. Have a small selection, a judicious selection of some of the physical practices of Hatha Yoga, and they invariably form a part of just about every yoga class, every yoga course. So now we can have a look at the pictures as an aid to understanding this school of yoga, Hatha Yoga. My pranams to the mother and Sri Aurobindo, and their love and blessings to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. These sessions are a part of the 150th birth anniversary of Sri Aurobindo and the 75th anniversary of India's independence. This will be an introduction to Hatha Yoga. As I said yesterday, I'm fond of introductions. So once again, it is only an introduction. One introduction that we have missed in these sessions is getting introduced to one another. And that was a little difficult in such a large group, and that too online. But then I find that we are getting introduced to some of you one by one through the emails that you are sending. Just to recapitulate what yoga is, as we saw a couple of days back, it's a journey towards self-perfection. And this self-perfection can involve all parts of the being and should involve ideally all parts of the being. And the parts of the being which we are most familiar with, which we can easily identify with, are the body and the mind, the physical and the mental. When it comes to the mind, it has two aspects, the emotional part of the being and the intellect. So it's a journey towards perfection of the body, the emotional part of the being, as well as the intellect. But then perfection should have a reference standard towards which we are taking these parts of the being, or the instruments that we have for action in the world. Now this reference point is the soul, but then we'll come to that later. But then when we look at these three aspects of perfection, the school of yoga that emphasizes perfection of the body is what Hatha Yoga is. And whether it be perfection of the physical or any other part of the being, and that comes by tuning that part of the being to the soul, which is the reference point, which is perfect. And as we take this part of the being through various disciplines towards perfection, its function improves because it can draw more and more on the light of the divine, which is what the soul is in each individual. Now, if we look at it from the evolutionary point of view, starting with dead matter, which was a sort of a gross self-limitation by the divine, the divine itself manifested as dead matter. And in fact, it's not even proper to call it dead. Perhaps it will be better to call it what Sri Aurobindo calls inconscient. That is, it seems to not be able to know and feel and do, but it's not dead because the potentiality of matter is what we see around us in everything, including human beings. So the life force or the spark of life was hidden in matter, and the rudiments of the mind were hidden in the creatures which had life, and the rudiments of what is to come after the human beings are there in the human being. So that is the evolutionary perspective. And if we look at it that way, then we find that each level or each leap in evolution represents an advance which is manifesting a little more of the divine that is there even in matter. So we start with matter, but then once there was a little awakening of the hidden divinity in matter, it manifested as life. And that's how we got creatures which were alive. And then, of course, came the mind. But then this movement from the physical to the creatures which had life was itself a big leap. And there was an equilibrium that was established between the two, in the sense that while the life force or prana had great possibilities and potentials, only some of it was used in creatures that were alive, because all of it was not necessary. For example, if we have been in a dark room for a long time and we want to see a little more, then we may switch on a torch and we'll be able to see our way better. But then if we are exposed suddenly to sunlight, actually what will happen is that instead of being able to see better, our eyes will be dazzled. So what in fact has happened in the creatures that were alive, the primitive creatures particularly, was that the life force created that little bit of additional light which made matter behave differently. So sort of a process which consisted of what we call life, that is a ticking of various physicochemical processes which created in that matter the characteristics of life, that took shape. But then this was only a part of what matter could do. So matter could do that with the help of this life force. The Adhara was there, the base was there, the material base was there, and now it could do certain things which we identify as life. And this equilibrium was established in such a way that it was enough for this creature to be alive. So what the life force did to matter was that created in it the capacity to live. Now, when the next leap, when the mind came, initially the mind was just sort of to further supplement the life force, in the sense that the creature, in addition to having the capacity to live, also now had an urge to live, because that is what the emotions are about. Basically, the basic instincts are about the urge to live. For example, food is essential for life. Air is essential for life. So when a person doesn't get food or doesn't get air, the person or the animal is miserable. And therefore, to escape this misery, and in anticipation of the relief and joy that it will get when it finds food or air, the person will, or the animal will, look for food and air. So this strong desire to live, this urge to live, was created by the emotions. Until then it was okay, because a balance was struck between the body, the life force, and the emotional part of the being in such a way that the animal had the capacity to live and the urge to live, and it was quite satisfied with that. The problem came when the intellect developed to the level it has in human beings. Because now this creature was not satisfied with just being able to live and having the urge to live, it wanted to go beyond. In other words, we might say that here was a creature, the human being, who was not satisfied with just existing. It truly wanted to live. So it wanted to go beyond mere survival. And it had an aspiration to go beyond that. It had a well-developed intellect to create that aspiration, and it also had the capacity to go beyond. And that is how it started turning to that deeper source, the soul, which could now take this creature, the human being, beyond that simple equilibrium which had been established in the animal by creating basically in matter the capacity to live and the urge to live. So the initial step was to create an equilibrium between the body and the life force. Now, this equilibrium exists also in human beings, and it is because of the limited amount of function that the life force is entrusted with in this equilibrium that many of the limitations of the body still remain. And if we let more of that life force guide and illumine the body, then many of those limitations of the physical can disappear. And that is what essentially Hatha Yoga is about. So Hatha Yoga is about firstly working on the physical part of the being to make it perform better, but then it also includes letting that life force or prana illumine the functioning of the body so that many of the limitations of the physical can be overcome. Further, since the life force is the bridge between the physical and the emotional part of the being, or the physical and the mind, the life force can work the other way also, create that possibility and that background for the mind to be able to influence the body better. Now, Sri Aurobindo has defined yoga as a methodized effort towards self-perfection. Now, this is a general principle which applies to everything, including Hatha Yoga, where we are talking about the self-perfection of the physical. And the techniques that we have in Hatha Yoga are that methodized effort. That is an effort which has a certain method about it, a certain scheme, a certain plan, and a certain philosophy behind it. The classical texts of Hatha Yoga are Hatha Yoga Pradipika and Gheranda Samhita. Hatha Yoga Pradipika is much older and has the names of hardly any asanas. Gheranda Samhita gives quite a few asanas, but then nowhere near the 80 or so which we normally talk about these days, that there are 80 basic asanas and there are several variations of each of them. That is a development which is even after Gheranda Samhita. The basic principles of any yoga, according to Sri Aurobindo, are firstly purification. That is trying to remove those obstacles, those impurities which prevent that particular part of the being from doing its best. Once that has been done, then we have created the background for concentration. That is concentrating the effort and energy of that part of the being so that it can do its best. And when that has been done through that concentrated effort against that background of a clean slate, as you might say, then that part of the being gets liberated from its usual limitations and weaknesses. Now, applied to Hatha Yoga, which is concentrating on the physical, using the life force as a higher principle in evolution. Firstly, the important thing is the purification of the body. And one of the impurities of the body is restlessness. And why is that restlessness there? The restlessness is there because the body is still not prepared for the full functioning of the life force. So that is what makes it restless. Then, concentration of physical energy. That is, once that restlessness has been taken care of, that has been removed, then the physical energy can be concentrated. That is, then, it can have a full play and let more of the life force manifest itself in the body. And then comes the liberation. From the limited play of the body can exceed its normal limits. And that is what the miraculous feats of the Hatha Yogis are about. So the basic cause of restlessness is the pranic Shakti not being able to have its full play in the body because of the limitations of the body. And this was necessary to start with, because if the full play had been allowed, then it would have led to a disaster. It like dazzling of the eyes, if you let all the light enter the eyes which have been accustomed to darkness. So dead matter was accustomed to that darkness, and to let that higher principle of life enter full force into that would have led to a disaster. It's something like, a child who has just started going to school. If that child is immediately sort of admitted to the PhD course, then the child will be nowhere. That will not do the child any good. Or say, if somebody who has been living in a situation of scarcity, suddenly he becomes a millionaire. He can't handle that money properly. So step by step, and that's why the full force was not allowed to act in the body, the full life force. And because the full force was not allowed, the body behaves in a restless manner and also has its limitations. And what is the cure? The cure is to prepare the body so that it will be able to handle a little more of that life force. So the starting point is the body, and that is where the postures come in. So the asanas. So therefore the asanas should come before we go to the next step, that is pranayama. And that is what we find also in Patanjali's scheme. So the first step is to cure the body of its restlessness, so that the background is prepared, the instrument is ready. Let the child graduate through primary school before we take the child to the secondary school. So before we give more, let the base be prepared, and that is what we do. And therefore, one of the basic things in the asanas is to achieve physical immobility. And this is important because these days, because in general, sort of our temperament has become restless because of the fast pace of life. Even the asanas are sometimes modified to make them very active. Some of the newer schools of yoga make these postures also look like they're done in a way as if they're a part of gymnastics. Fast movements, rapid movements, repetitive movements, so that the body still remains restless. So we are satisfying that urge for restlessness, that urge for speed, that urge for a fast pace to which we have got accustomed, but that actually will not prepare the instrument, the bodily instrument, for a better functioning of the life force, which is important, in fact, which is the basic thing in the improvement of the body itself, because the body has to be able to receive that life force in a greater measure before it can perform really better. So the two basic methods of Hatha Yoga are asanas and pranayamas. Asanas to prepare that background so that more of the prana can enter, and then pranayama to let that life force work in the body on one hand, and also prepare the background for the better body now being able to be under the control of a better illumined mind. So prana works both ways. We might say lower and upper level, both levels, on the body as well as on the mind. So what are the results of these asanas? Done properly, they cure the body of its restlessness. And as a result of it itself, the health improves, the body becomes stronger, and it becomes more pliable, more flexible, more supple. And some of the limitations of the body are also overcome, like laziness. The body is lazy because that in fact is required in the bodily instrument to some extent, because it requires that stability. So stability translates into laziness. While stability is good, laziness is not. And therefore, this becomes a limitation, and that is removed. And that's how you find that people who have been practicing yoga, they sometimes seem to have a tremendous amount of energy. They don't get easily tired. And one wonders that where does all that energy come from, irrespective of age? Now, all that comes because those limitations of the body have to some extent been removed by letting more of that life force, the pranic shakti, do its job in the body. Disease is another limitation. In fact, ideally, the body is not geared for disease, it's geared for health. Now, to be able to have less disease or no disease, perhaps that's also possible. It's again, what is required is to let that life force work better, and those limitations can be overcome again by firstly preparing the body and then letting that life force work in that body, which has been cured of its basic restlessness, which was there in the first place because the life force could not act properly because of the limitations. A certain equilibrium was enough for living, but it was not enough for the optimum functioning of the physical instrument. Then aging. Again, that is not necessarily inevitable. And certainly what has been seen is that through yogic practices, the process of aging can be slowed down. And you'll find numerous examples, much better than mine, in which people can do a lot at an old age. I have seen people 100-year-old perform the headstand, Shirshasana, the inverted posture. And you might have also heard of many people beyond 100 who can perform many bodily feats bordering on the miraculous. But to give you a little more ordinary example, a person like me who has been practicing yoga in a very half-hearted manner, I had pain in the neck. Most of the time, I'm only a pain in the neck. But when I was around 65, I got neck pain, which was refusing to go away. And then I went to the doctor. I was asked to get an X-ray of the neck done. And having a look at that X-ray, the radiologist said, well, there are some age-related spondylotic changes. But then for your age, it's okay. It's nice because I would pass off this X-ray as quite normal for a 40 to 45-year-old. So even with that half-hearted practice, my biological age at 65 was just 45. So 20 years difference in the rate of aging. So what an average 40-year-old's spine looks like, my spine was looking like that at age 65. So that is the difference it can make. So the power of physical immobility is as important in Hatha Yoga as the power of mental immobility in the Yoga of Knowledge. Yoga of Knowledge is Raja Yoga, which we'll start talking about the day after tomorrow. So this curing this restlessness is essentially about physical immobility. And that is important in Hatha Yoga. In Raja Yoga, in the same way, we try to cure the mind of its restlessness. Why is the mind restless? Again, for similar reasons, because the soul is not able to manifest fully in the mind. And therefore, the mind is restless. And therefore, to prepare the background for the soul to be able to illumine the mind, we first have to put the mind at peace. And that is what meditative techniques are about. So, we are going step by step in evolution. In yoga also, we are following the same sort of sequence as in evolution. So after the physical came the life force, and we are trying to, through Hatha Yoga, we are trying to make this life force have a fuller play in the physical. After the life force came the mind. And of course, the soul has always been behind there. But straight away taking the soul to the body may be more difficult, but it's easier to take the life force to the body and make it work more. And that is what we do in Hatha Yoga. Once that has been done, we can go to the next step, and that is the soul illumining the mind, because the mind is now prepared because of the life force now working better in the instrument. Now we come to pranayamas. Now, what do the pranayamas achieve? They achieve better physical power because the asanas have improved the instrument, the bodily instrument to some extent. And on this improved instrument, the life force can have a fuller play. And then the person gradually finds that the person is able to direct the vital energy to any part of the body so that it can work better in that part. So if there's a disease in some part, the person is able to direct the life force in that direction. Because what all the life force can do, actually, a medical person or a person familiar with life sciences can understand very well. Because these mechanisms are so well tuned to the requirements of the body in health and disease, that if we let them have their full play, in the first place, probably nothing will go wrong. And if it does, then by and large, the mechanisms residing within the body, which are a manifestation, a physicochemical manifestation of this vital energy, because vital energy is a subtle thing, but then the subtle thing is manifesting itself through the gross. So the gross as a base is certainly important. So the gross is in all those chemicals in the body which are behaving in a certain way because of this life force, so that most of the time they're able to keep the body in good health. And in case of disease, they are able to lead to recovery. So by directing the vital energy towards that, person can achieve good results. And that vital energy can be directed because the person starts having more and more control over that life force. So pranayama is basically about having control over the life force. So it's not essentially just sort of those physical practices of breathing practices, which we call pranayama. In the wider sense, pranayama is being able to have a better control over the life force, or one might even say not better control, but achieve the conditions under which the life force can act more freely than it normally does. So it can do its job better, it can work more than it normally does, it can manifest more of its potential. So basically, all yoga is about manifesting our potential better. So by working on the body through asanas, we make the body achieve more in terms of its potential. And then in the same way, by working on the prana through pranayamas, we can make the life force achieve more of its potential. And when it achieves more of its potential, we find that not only we are able to make it do better, but because it has been working also on the mind-body connection improves. And through the mind, which now has been improved through the practice of pranayama as being a bridge between the body and the mind can now direct that vital energy to the part of the body which is diseased. And third thing is liberates the body from its weaknesses like disease and aging. So in a way, pranayama completes what asanas initiate. So preparing the instrument better, the adhar better, is the first step, and then the pranayama completes. Something like, what the child learns in primary school is the initiation. And then when the child goes to secondary school, that completes what started in the primary school. Now, this is something beautiful that Sri Aurobindo has brought out, that the results of Hatha Yoga can be looked upon as a sort of a reversal of relationship. Ordinarily, we feel, that the soul is within the individual, and particularly the mind, and then the mind is within the body, and pranic force being so subtle, we don't even think of it. Basically, we think of ourselves as the body and the mind, not in terms of the life force, because we can identify with the body and the mind, but not with the life force, that intermediate step. So, but if we understand the parts of the being better, then we feel as if the body contains the life force. It is that force which is animating the body. So the life force is within the body. And the body is using this life force to stay alive. Of course, the body uses it, but only to the extent it can, because the instrument is not ready to use the life force to its fullness, and therefore only a limited use of this life force has been allowed to start with. Something like I said, using only a torch, or teaching the child only in a primary school. So that is the type of beginning that has been allowed in creatures that are living, and the body seems to be making use of that limited use of the life force to do what it does in a living creature. But what happens in an accomplished Hatha Yogi is that now the life force contains the body, which means that the life force takes over fully and it uses the body. And since the life force is a higher principle than the body, handing over the charge to the life force improves the functioning of the body and makes the body overcome its limitations. So that is how the limitations are overcome. And the same thing happens when we work on the mind. Because ordinarily, the mind contains the spiritual force, that is what we feel. And as and when the body wants to function better, it can draw upon that spiritual force, and that's very elated, and it has that feeling of exaltation that, see how much better I have been able to do by draw on that hidden source of light, that spiritual force. The person can concentrate better, or is able to write better, or speak better. And then the person feels that, yes, the spiritual force is helping me. It is helping my mind function better. But in an accomplished yogi, again, the relationship is reversed. The spiritual force contains the body. The spiritual force takes over full charge and then uses the mind only as an instrument. And that's how the limitations of the mind can be overcome. And a person who is working on the mind, which we shall talk about when we talk about Raja Yoga, is able to overcome the ordinary limitations of the mind and perform mental feats which border on the miraculous. So Hatha Yoga has immense possibilities when it comes to the body. And some of those we are familiar with in the most advanced Hatha Yogis, like the ability to live without food and water for a long time, the ability to live without air for a long time, and being able to walk on nails. Also, abilities such as becoming extremely small, or becoming much bigger, becoming very light and being able to float, levitation, or becoming so heavy that nobody can move them. So all those siddhis have been recorded and are a possibility. But then these possibilities become a weakness for the ordinary person. And most of us are ordinary, and we are not looking up to that sort of miraculous feats. The weaknesses are twofold, in fact. If a person is able to perform all those miracles, it can boost the ego of the person, because the person can then feel that I am now one notch above humanity, and can use these miraculous feats as an exhibition. He can display them and become an exhibitionist. But a still greater weakness, because of these possibilities, is that they will require a lot of time and effort. And the person will be spending all 24 hours a day for decades trying to acquire these abilities. And then if that is done, then what is the use of this perfect body if it cannot be put to any good use for anything else? So it becomes an achievement which really has no practical use in ordinary life. And that is one of the greatest weaknesses of Hatha Yoga. And that is why, by and large, nobody goes to that extent in the practice of Hatha Yoga, although those possibilities do exist. But then that itself becomes a weakness. And that is important to understand, because otherwise one would feel that if that is all what Hatha Yoga is about, one would feel as if it's meant only for a select few who can go all the way. But then yoga is a graded process. We don't have to go all the way. One can use some of the basic principles of any school of yoga in such a way that they can improve our functioning in daily life and yet leave us time for living a normal life. So the significance of Hatha Yoga is that the body and the pranic force, they form the base. The body is the material base, and it's the pranic force that keeps it alive. And the better the pranic force is able to act in this body, the less the limitations of the body will be. And therefore, to take good care of this basic instrument, the body, Hatha Yoga is important. It has this significance of improving the functioning of the body in itself, and also improving it further, overcome some of the limitations by letting the pranic force work better in this body. That is the significance. So Sri Aurobindo therefore says that when it comes to the place of Hatha Yoga and integral yoga, the aims of Hatha Yoga have been included in the synthesis that he has worked out in integral yoga. The aims are that the body is important as an instrument, and therefore it should be cared for. The body should not be neglected. But then the use of the methods of Hatha Yoga should be limited. How much limited? To what extent limited? That is left to the individual, because each individual is different, has a different type of body, has a different type of temperament, has a different type of routine, and different types of aims and aspirations in life. And therefore, the extent to which the person uses the techniques of yoga has been left to the individual. But some limited use to improve the functioning of the bodily instrument is an important part of integral yoga. Therefore, the answer to this question is obvious. Hatha Yoga has been rejected by Sri Aurobindo because Sri Aurobindo's approach to yoga was to emphasize mental perfection. Of course, Sri Aurobindo has rationalized all spiritual truths. He has rationalized the processes of yoga, but that doesn't mean that he has rejected Hatha Yoga itself, which is primarily about improving the functioning of the body. In fact, this type of a question, for those of you who are teachers, can be converted into another type of question, a multiple choice type of question, which are called the assertion reason type of questions. And then it can be a very interesting question. What one can say is, assertion is Hatha Yoga has been rejected by Sri Aurobindo, and the reason given in the question is Sri Aurobindo's approach to yoga was to emphasize mental perfection. Now, this will be a question in which the assertion is wrong and the reason given is also wrong. Hatha Yoga has not been rejected by Sri Aurobindo, and Sri Aurobindo's approach to yoga was not to emphasize just mental perfection. So both the statements are wrong. So this is one of the options in those multiple choice questions where the assertion and the reason are both wrong. And sometimes one thinks that how can one have such a question which can still be plausible to make two wrong statements and still exercises the mind enough for the student to answer it, because the question still looks plausible. So the answer is false. Hatha Yoga has been perfected by Sri Aurobindo by describing a unique way of exactly how each asana should be done. Sri Aurobindo has not rejected Hatha Yoga, but then this is not what integral yoga is about. Some people do come and ask, in fact, sometimes, how did Sri Aurobindo want us to do the asanas? He didn't go into those details because Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga is not a technique-intensive yoga. It's not about exactly how each asana should be done and then setting up a dogma that exactly this number of asanas should be done in exactly this way, and then only you'll be doing yoga. It is not about that. It is about letting the asanas and pranayamas enter the practice to the extent that is reasonable, moderate, leaving time for engagement with daily life, worldly life, and at the same time in keeping with the temperament, capacity, and inclinations of the student. So the person has to carve his or her own path, and within that fit these practices to the extent that appears reasonable. So this is also false. Some of the places where you can find material related to what we've talked today is this book, once again, A Primer on Yoga, gives something very basic about Hatha Yoga in chapter 2. And those who want to go deeper into the subject nothing like Sri Aurobindo's synthesis of yoga. The newer editions are a part of the collected works of Sri Aurobindo, and in that it forms 2 volumes, 23 and 24. The chapters where you find Hatha Yoga are the chapter 4 in the introductory part of the book. The title of the chapter is The Systems of Yoga. And in part 2 of the book, chapter 27 in part 2, which is on Hatha Yoga. So these are the 2 places where you find a detailed, comprehensive treatment of Hatha Yoga in the synthesis of yoga. It's very easy to get because all the works of Sri Aurobindo are now available for free download on the website of Sri Aurobindo Ashram Pondicherry, sriaurobindoashram.org. And all you have to do is just enter some of these important keywords like Sri Aurobindo's, the synthesis of yoga, PDF, download. You'll find on top will come probably that particular entry. And you just have to click once there. You don't even have to open the website, and exactly the volume you are looking for will get downloaded in your computer. That's all you have to do. Just click on that entry itself. This is the meditation hall and the shrine at Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch, the place where I live and work. And it might appear inviting enough to you to come here. You're most welcome when the circumstances are better. If you have any questions or comments, or you want these slides, or you want to subscribe to the Ashram magazines, which are online and completely free, please feel free to drop an email at sa150yes@gmail.com. So far as the Ashram magazines are concerned, in fact, unless any of you has any objection, probably you wouldn't have, we can put all of you on the mailing list of the Ashram magazines. There are 2 of them, one which you will get on the 1st of every month, which gives you the recent activities of the ashram and about what is coming during the month. Another magazine which you get in the middle of the month, The Call Beyond, is an interactive magazine. It has some reading matter. And this year in 2022, being the year of Sri Aurobindo's 150th birth anniversary, we are focusing on one of the works of Sri Aurobindo in each issue. The January issue has focused on essays on the Gita. So it gives you a little glimpse into that work. And then, of course, you can always get into that work in greater detail for more serious study very easily by downloading the entire book, as I said, free from the website of Sri Aurobindo Ashram Pondicherry. Thank you.
Hello. Sir. Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, sir. Actually, yesterday I attended the live class. And as you know, yesterday the time was not supporting to ask some questions. So today I have planned to ask.
Sure.
It is regarding the breathing practice. Sir, actually, I am doing my breathing practice from a long time period. And when I'm taking my breath during inhalation, actually my abdomen, it is not going moving up actually. So what you have explained, you have specially focused on that point, very pinpointed manner. But though I'm trying a lot still, the inhalation and exhale process, just opposite is going on. So is it a problem actually, or I can manage through that? Because I'm very much comfortable in that way, and I can retain my breath also for a long time. So please just help me to do.
This is a fairly common problem, and this happens because of the dresses we wear. You know, our dresses are generally tight around the waist, and therefore they don't allow for proper movement of the abdomen, and therefore most of us are chest breathers. And One might say that that's okay, but then one doesn't then have the full capacity to breathe. Not only that, the abdominal breathing is much more efficient than chest breathing, because just a little movement of the diaphragm, the diaphragm is the partition between the chest and the abdomen. Just a little movement can increase the chest capacity with relatively less muscular effort than the increase in the chest capacity which one would achieve by movement of the ribs. That takes far more effort. And therefore, the proper way to breathe is that if you require to use only a limited part of the capacity to breathe, as is the case in our normal life, we don't need that full capacity. The rest is a reserve. The most efficient way to breathe is to use the abdomen. That is, the abdomen goes out. So that is the right way. In fact, if you look at a newborn baby lying down, you'll find that the abdomen goes up and down a lot, because that is how the baby breathes. That is how we start breathing. But it's later our dresses which make us chest breathers. Now, as I said yesterday, perhaps, again, that the best way to once again resume the right way to breathe is in the lying down position. It's easier to breathe properly when one is lying down than when it's sitting, and it's most difficult in the standing position. So the right time to get back to the right way of breathing is when one is doing shavasana in the lying down position. That's why it's emphasized a lot in the lying down position. Another related question which people ask is that when we breathe, the air should be going to the lungs. Then why is the abdomen going out? The air is still going into the lungs. It's not going into the abdomen. And the reason why it happens is that for the air to be able to enter the lungs, the capacity of the chest should improve. And one way to increase the capacity of the chest is for the partition between the chest and the abdomen to go down. That partition is the diaphragm. When it goes down, which means it goes towards the abdomen, the capacity of the chest increases from above downwards. So from top to bottom of the chest, now the capacity is more because the partition has gone down. But then when the partition is going down, what is it doing to the abdomen? It is pressing on the stomach and intestines. And therefore the stomach and the intestines bulge out. And that is why the abdomen goes out. So abdomen is going out because the stomach and the intestines are bulging out, not because the air is going into the abdomen. The air still goes into the chest. Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. Okay, thank you, sir.
Namaste, sir. So this is Sunita.
Namaste.
Namaste, sir. Sir, the way you have explained Raj Yoga and Hatha Yoga today, it appears like they are both complementary to each other, and any person who wants to pursue the path of yoga has to follow both of them to be able to allow the pranic force to have control over the body as well as the mind. In some other texts that I have gone through, I read that Hatha Yoga is the way which first focuses on the body, and then through that it then comes over to the mind. Whereas it is just the reverse in case of Raj Yoga. It first talks about the training of the mind, and then comes over to the body. So, according to that, these are two completely separate streams. Whereas what you discussed today, what I could get was that these are complementary and have to be practiced together for a complete result. So what is the right way to look at it?
Well, I would suggest that firstly, you should have patience till we go to integral yoga. Because as I said, Hatha Yoga has immense possibilities, but also has weaknesses. Raja Yoga has immense possibility, it also has weaknesses. But they both have some important principles which can be incorporated in a synthesis. The strict division between Hatha Yoga and Raja Yoga is artificial. In fact, there's a continuum. And that is why you find that in Patanjali's Raja Yoga also, when we come to the 8 limbs, the asanas and pranayamas come before those parts of the Ashtanga, those 8 limbs, which are more focused on meditation. So it's not that the body has been neglected in Raja Yoga. You do not find the same degree of emphasis. So it's the emphasis which differs. It's not that the body can be neglected and one can work exclusively on the mind. The body still remains the base. And that is why asanas and pranayamas have been put before those limbs which would focus primarily on the mind. And that is why it's also sometimes said that Hatha Yoga, in fact, is a part of Raja Yoga, because you can't practice Raja Yoga in its entirety without paying attention to the body. Because if the body is not in a good shape, trying to control the mind will be difficult. To put it very simply, if a person tries to meditate while having a pain in the body somewhere, if someone sits down in a meditative posture, but one has osteoarthritis and so knees are paining, will the person be able to meditate? So the body has to be in a reasonably good shape before one can start working on the mind.
Thank you, sir.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for your wisdom and love you are offering to us. My question is about pranayama. How pranayama can help to bring the psychic being out to the body, manifest the psychic being in the body. Thank you.
Pranayama being the bridge, it will help in taking the mind to a level where it will be more receptive to the influence of the soul or the psychic being. Because the soul or the psychic being has to act primarily on the mind so that we make the type of choices which are in keeping with that inner voice. And then the body will implement it, and the body will be able to implement it only so long as the life force is permeating the body. So that is how pranayama can help. It works both ways, towards the body and towards the mind, improves the functioning of the body, helps it overcome the limitations, and it also helps in putting the mind in that receptive mode so that it will be able to receive the influence of the psychic being better. And does that help? Thank you.
Namaskar, sir. When we speak about the spiritual force, does that mean the soul? And does this soul means complete silence?
Force is only one of the aspects of the divine, and therefore also one of the aspects of the soul. Broadly speaking, one can say that whether it's the divine or its spark, the soul is a consciousness. Now, consciousness, we can easily understand, has at least two aspects. One is to know. For example, we know our surroundings through what you see and hear. We become aware of it. So to know is one part of consciousness. The other part of consciousness, to be able to do. I decide to move my hand and I'm able to move my hand. Now, which means to be able to do something. These are the two broad aspects of consciousness. Now, the divine consciousness also has these two major aspects, and the divine consciousness is such that it knows everything and it can do everything. The ability to do everything can be called a force. But then we don't normally use that word force. We call it a power. There's a difference between a power and a force in the sense that a power is a self-aware force. A force which is enlightened by all knowledge cannot be called just a force, because force can also be blind. It's a self-aware force which knows everything. So it's a power. And that's why very often when we say, you must have read in the works of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, when they say, talk about the spiritual element enlightening the instrument, they talk about the love, light, power, beauty, all these aspects of that divine consciousness. So these are all various aspects of the divine consciousness. Force is one of them, which perhaps is better called power because of its being a fully self-aware force. There was one more question perhaps associated with it. I think you had asked one more thing, I think. Silence. The other question was about silence. Silence, again, can be sometimes misunderstood. Silence only means keeping only what is necessary, getting rid of everything that is unnecessary. Silence doesn't mean being blank. Silence doesn't mean being incapable of doing anything. So a silent mind is a mind which has become more receptive because it is concentrating only on what is absolutely essential. And if one comes to think of it, much of thinking is unnecessary, and therefore much of speech is also unnecessary, because our speech basically is expressing our thoughts. So both are most of the time unnecessary. And that is what the mother has emphasized in the austerity of speech. She has talked quite at length about austerity of speech, where she says that speaking only as much as is necessary is far more difficult than staying totally silent for a limited period of time. Just as, observing a total fast for a limited period of time is easier than to eat only as much as is necessary all the time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat box. Did Sri Aurobindo practice pranayam for more than 1 hour? Is that helpful?
I don't know about the duration, how long Sri Aurobindo practiced, but Sri Aurobindo did practice pranayama particularly, perhaps even more than asanas, and he went into very advanced practices. For some time, when he was extremely busy, he didn't have time to practice them, and that also he has talked about. When he was in the freedom struggle and he didn't have time, he said that once he had fallen ill, he said that in Baroda, when I used to practice pranayamas, I seldom fell ill. It is now that I'm not finding time for it that perhaps it's happening. So he did practice, and not only did practice, you can make out from the synthesis of yoga that he's talking not on the basis of theory, but through personal experience about what advanced pranayamas can do. More may be available, which I have not read those works, in Records on Yoga, because that is, they were meant to be personal notes on his own sadhana, but somehow they have got published now, and they are also a part of the complete works of Sri Aurobindo, the Records on Yoga.
The next question is, could one say in general that wrong mental attitude is blocking the flow of the life force? For instance, when people resist yoga or become ill.
Yes, man is basically a mental creature, and therefore it is through the mind that we can reduce the capacity of the body. We can reduce the capacity of the life force to do its job in the body. And we can also reduce the influence, prevent the influence of the soul on acting on the mind, and through that in our life. So mind, basically we are mental creatures, and therefore the mind can work both on the body and the life force, and can also block the soul. So in that sense, mind can be an obstacle. But then since we are mental creatures, and it is the mind that has created in us also the aspiration to go beyond where we are, the mind can also be a great collaborator. Not just the mental or the intellectual part of the being, but also the emotional part of the being. Even that can become a great collaborator. In fact, the emotional part of the being can be a much stronger collaborator than the intellect, because the intellect can vacillate and weigh things, how difficult it will be, how long will it take, and so on. But once you are passionate about something, and that can happen also about the divine, then all those calculations go out and one just takes the plunge. So that plunge is taken because of the emotional part of the being. So since we are primarily mental creatures, the mind can be a great collaborator, including the emotional part of the being, including the vital. That's what, and the vital Sri Aurobindo has used for both the life force and also for this emotional part of the being, because the two are associated. One is creating one aspect, that is the life force, just the pure life force is creating the capacity to live. And on the other hand, the emotional part of the being, that part of the vital is creating the urge to live. But then in human beings, it goes beyond the urge to live. It also creates the urge to go beyond where we are, the urge to be one with the divine. So that also comes from the vital. So the vital can have that inner aspect, that inner vital, which is illumined by the soul, in which that barrier between the mind and the soul has disappeared. And then the mind turns with great passion and intensity to the divine. And then, of course, the rational part of the being, the intellect, easily falls in line because it is basically the emotions that rule us.
Namaste, sir.
Namaste.
Sir, can I ask a question on the blinds, which you said right now? It means you want to say any spiritual practice lead to yoga?
No, is the question that does any spiritual practice lead to yoga? Any
Yes,
spiritual practice can be a part of yoga. I'm not sure what actually you mean by spiritual practice, because sometimes there's also a mix-up between religious rituals and spiritual practices. Religious rituals can be a good preparation, although they may not be an essential or mandatory or compulsory part of yoga, but all the same, they can be good preparation. If you elaborate on the question a bit, maybe we can have a little more discussion. What's your name?
Sir, I'm Jyoti. I'm speaking from Navi Mumbai. I'm residing in Navi Mumbai right now.
Okay.
Sir, so my question is because you just talked about the soul and the human. So they said there is a union between the two, the soul and the body. That's the actual meaning of yoga. When you unite yourself with that. The Aham Brahma Asmi, the Mahavakya says this. Right? So based on that, I'm saying any spiritual practice which is leading us to the supreme power, which is leading us to the supreme nature, is it the kind of yoga? Because again, there is a union. We're trying to search that ultimate power. Our focus is pertaining to that power. Is it the correct statement or no? Like, I want your sir insight on this.
Well, in a way, broadly speaking, you're right that anything that we do with that aspiration, even if it is only a shuffling sort of or stumbling sort of steps, but so long as that aspiration is there and it's sincere and intense, and we are doing it with that intention of moving closer to the divine, so that our instruments, that is the body and the mind, work more and more in that light, that becomes a part of yoga. Because yoga is not only the goal of union, yoga is also the path that takes us there.
Yes, sir. Rightly said, sir. Thank you so much.
I have a question, sir. We have read Sri Aurobindo used to do pranayama for about 3 to 4 hours or even more than that in the early stages. My question is, what was the pranayama he used to do and why he stopped doing that afterwards?
Well, I can make a few guesses, which may or may not be right. One is that he used to do those practices because he found them helpful. And he probably, when he didn't do them, it was because he didn't have time. And maybe later on, he didn't do them that much because they were not necessary for him. Because one can transcend the need for those techniques after evolving to a certain point. They become necessary. So they become unnecessary, they become redundant. Just as, if one uses this silence of, say, Maunavrat to train the mind, it is maybe a good beginning, but then when one has got accustomed to speaking only as much as is necessary, that Maun Vrat may not be necessary anymore. Or if one eats only as much as is necessary, then a ritualistic fast may not be necessary anymore. So maybe he didn't need it after a certain stage. He was all the time in that state where his life force was doing its job as much as it could. It was acting fully on both the body and the mind. So that there was no barrier. Everything was bridged and connected now. Nothing, no technique was necessary to weaken those barriers which we have between the body and the life force, between the life force and the mind, and between the mind and the soul. So those barriers which we start with were no longer there.
Is it known which pranayama he was practicing at that point of time?
Well, they were advanced pranayamas, but I can't say what they were. And in general, advanced pranayamas go from a point where we are just trying to regulate the pattern of breathing, keeping inhalation and exhalation approximately equal, then going on increasing the ratio of the exhalation as compared to inhalation more and more, which means exhalation takes much longer than inhalation. We go in that direction. And secondly, we also start introducing what is called kumbhaka, that is stopping the breath between inhalation and exhalation, between exhalation and inhalation. So those goes on increasing. So that is the general trend in which advanced pranayamas go. I haven't myself practiced them, and it is also said that one should not practice them except under supervision, because they can also lead to various types of disasters.
Okay, thank you.
If there are no questions, I just want to ask one question. In your entire conversation today, what came out was that urge to progress. And also another thing is that wherever you start with, like depending on the questions also that came in, you end up including all the aspects. So how does one develop that ability or that awareness that I am progressing? So maybe if I'm starting with, say, pranayama, or I'm starting with the asanas, this is now the mind taking over, or this is a time that I can just let go of this, and now this is required. So though we have that urge to progress, but we often find ourselves being attached to just one practice. So how does that one maintain that balance and express that progress in whatever path they're choosing? So if you can speak a little on that.
Well, if I've understood the question correctly, yoga is certainly about progress, and for which the person has an aspiration. The person makes a beginning with what is basic, and also with what is most in keeping with the person's temperament and circumstances. That is where one begins. But then as one goes beyond that, one may find oneself getting involved also in those aspects of yoga, those practices of yoga, which the person initially felt that these are things which I'm not interested in. So the person may get more and more involved in those. And at the same time, it could also happen that beyond a certain stage, then the person is using those things in everyday life and does not feel the necessity to further strengthen those abilities through properly designed practices. So all these things can be a part of that progress and evolution. And that is why in integral yoga, I mean, there's no rigid path there are which has to be followed. And the person can keep changing as time goes, because that in fact is in a way to sort of describe progress. So long as the person feels that I'm going forwards and not backwards, the person is on the path of yoga. And to go beyond where one is, certainly a change is necessary, and that change may involve also in change in the type of techniques and processes that the person is using. In fact, even when it comes to just the physical practices of yoga, like asanas and pranayamas, one finds that initially very enthusiastic people may start with 1.5 to 2 hours of these practices in a day. Say, keep one session of 1 hour for asanas and another for half of an hour for pranayamas, another half an hour for meditation. So they may be spending quite regularly 2 hours a day on these practices. But then they find that gradually all that is not very necessary, and they are able to achieve the same degree of physical and mental immobility using much less time. And also, they find that quite a bit of it starts spilling over into their everyday life, which means that not just the asanas, but all their movements in everyday life start becoming more conscious. And not only during meditation, but even otherwise, they have less of that mental noise going on. Not only during meditation, even otherwise, when they are doing any study, they are able to concentrate better. It's not only during meditation, but even otherwise, when they are doing a mental job, they find that their efficiency goes up. They get the best of ideas as if from some higher force to which the barrier has been weakened. All the thoughts and ideas and the best of whatever they can do mentally is flowing in. When they fall ill, they find that it becomes very easily to them to turn to that higher force to work through their mind, eventually on the body, and direct the life force there so that that part starts healing. So they start actually doing all this without necessarily spending that much time on practices as a regular routine.
Sir, actually, I have one more question, a small question.
Yes, sure.
So
What's your
actually, in the
name?
past, Prasant Kumar Rao.
Prasant, yes, I see your comments quite often.
Yeah,
Prasant.
sir. Actually, sir, in the path of yoga, is it necessary or essential for that vegetarian food? It's a very small and common question, sir.
Well, generally speaking, yes, it would be helpful, because just as the mind influences what we do also influences the mind. So the two-way relationship. And therefore, a vegetarian diet would help, especially if done with the right attitude, because vegetarian diets are adopted for three primary reasons. One is for health reasons. That will not contribute much to the spiritual aspects of what we eat. The second is for ecological reasons, because the vegetarian diets are much more eco-friendly. If one does it with full awareness of the harmony which should exist in the creation and trying to correct the imbalance which human beings have created, it will have some spiritual element to it. The third reason is that one wants to avoid pain to other living beings. And one can assume that in the process of getting killed, the animal did suffer. So if it is the thought for not inflicting pain, then it will have a greater spiritual purpose. It all depends on the motive. And if one does it with that, then the mind is influencing what we eat, and then what we eat will influence the mind. Because if the mind is working in that direction, but then one, for the sake of the sensory pleasure of the palate, one continues taking a non-vegetarian diet, a person will not feel easy. He'll feel uneasy, that because there'll be a conflict between what the person knows what is right and at the same time is doing what is not right for the sake of a sensory pleasure. So that will create great uneasiness. That is what the conflict between the psychic being and what we are doing will bring out. And that's how the person will feel uneasy. Since there is some time, maybe I can share with you an anecdote, and maybe that can be the last. How did I turn vegetarian? I didn't eat too much meat. I didn't relish it too much, but then for social reasons, I continued eating it till I was about 45. And the social reasons, you can justify everything. That if I go to a party, I'll not be a nuisance. I'll eat whatever is made available. If I go to a Western country where vegetarian food is not available, I'll have no difficulty. If I get guests, I'll be able to offer them what they like, and so on. So, you can always justify everything. So I was not strictly speaking a vegetarian till I was about 45. Then, there was a conference organized at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences on vegetarian diets. And I was asked to speak on how vegetarian diets can help prevent cancer. I studied the topic. I was going to speak on it. But then I thought that if I'm going to speak on this topic and I'm a non-vegetarian, I'll not feel good. That's when I gave up. That's how I stopped having stopped having a non-vegetarian diet. And then I got some further encouragement, as well as some very startling anecdote during the closing function of that conference. For the closing function, the chief guest was Dr. L.M. Singhvi, who was not only a reputed jurist, but was also a diplomat. He was the High Commissioner of India to England for quite a few years, Dr. L.M. Singhvi. He was the chief guest at the closing function, and he said that when he as a young boy was studying law in England, one day he heard a knock on the door, and he was staying in an apartment as a student, and at the door were a middle-aged British couple who asked whether they could come in. Naturally, you would say, please come in. And they looked rather sad. They said that we had only one son, and he has committed suicide. And in the suicide note, he has said that if it is essential to eat meat to stay alive, I don't want to live. We have heard that you are a vegetarian. We don't know how to cook vegetarian food. Please, can you teach us a few recipes? Because in memory of our son, we want to turn vegetarian. Now, this was a very telling anecdote in the sense that it showed that, of course, this was a common belief in England those days, that you cannot live on a purely vegetarian diet. So the boy just acted on that belief, believing that it is completely true, which is not true. But all the same, the boy believed in it. But then his psychic being told him that if this is so, then I need not live. And he acted on that voice, which means it has really nothing to do with religion. It has nothing to do with what people around you are doing. An exceptional individual can take action and listen to that voice of the psychic being, irrespective of everything else. And that is what this boy had done. And then his parents also wanted to do the same in his memory. So this was a very telling anecdote. And so I felt that it's good that I turned vegetarian before the closing function, before speaking in the conference, I turned vegetarian. I was very happy. And Dr. Singhvi said one more thing, that anyone who has been a vegetarian since birth because his parents were vegetarian has perhaps not done as difficult a thing as those who have been non-vegetarians for a long time and then given up meat. So that way, I got a little pat on the back also.
Just one last question for today. Will you please explain the reversal role of life force and body by an accomplished Hatha Yogi with an example?
Accomplished Hatha Yogis, few I can name. One of the most recent ones that comes to my mind is that Yoga Guru B.K.S. Iyengar. He was a highly accomplished Hatha Yogi, could do all the difficult practices until he was about 100. One can assume that he would have achieved that type of a reversal of role, that is, in that his life force was using the body as an instrument, not the other way around. Normally, the body uses the life force as an instrument. But here, the life force is using the body as an instrument. So the relationship is reversed. In his case, one would assume that probably that had happened.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Sir, I'm Charu. I'm intrigued you were speaking about the restlessness and how Hatha Yoga and different forms of yoga can help us settle down that restlessness and bring more restfulness. Could you elaborate a little more on that? With all the stimulations in the world, yes, we all are experiencing restlessness in one form or the other, and no one day is same also. However, yes, yoga and pranayams, I understand that the vital force plays around and brings more, it makes it more channelized, your energies and your vitality. But could you please elaborate a little more on that?
Yes, if you practice asanas, you might have seen that initially when you start going into an asana, you will feel an intense stretch when you are in your final position. But then if you try to sort of take your attention a little away from the body towards the divine, and that can be done in many ways. One of the ways is that you marvel at the beautiful sort of capacity that the divine has given you to keep this body alive and healthy through a very delicately balanced set of mechanisms. And that is how you are able to maintain this posture. Your attention will be diverted from the posture. You will be still in the posture, but your posture will become effortless, and that stretch will become enjoyable. You'll hardly feel the stretch. You'll be just as comfortable as if you're sitting on a chair. So that is sort of that physical immobility. And the Patanjali has talked about it. He says two things, important things about the asanas. One is Thirsukhasanam. That is, in an asana, you should be stable and comfortable. So it's only when you are comfortable and not feeling that pain of the stretch or discomfort of the stretch that you are in asana. And how does that happen? He says, Ananta Samapatti Bhyama. Prayatna Shaitilya. You achieve Prayatna Shaitilya, that is the absence of conscious effort. You achieve that effortless maintenance of posture. How? Ananta Samapatti Bhyam, by meditating on the Ananta. Ananta, is without an end. That is the limitless, the infinite. So when you meditate on the infinite, you are able to achieve effortlessness during the posture. And that is how it becomes stable and comfortable. So that is what physical immobility and curing the restlessness is about. If one does it as a practice 20 times a day, if you're practicing 20 asanas, then it starts spilling over into the rest of your life. The rest of your life also, your body will remain relatively restful. It will not be restless. And you'll also find that all your movements will become more and more conscious. You'll find that accidents will become very unlikely. When you're chopping vegetables in the kitchen, you will not cut your finger instead. When you're walking on the road, you will not stumble on a stone. Now, all those things happen because your movements become more conscious. So the effect spills over.
Understandable, sir. Thank you very much.
All right, with that, we come to the end of yet another session. For tomorrow, we will have the second practical session, Graded Approach 2. And today we'll just end with a meditation as usual for us.
Kama